He walked in with a dream. They saw a problem. For one ambitious teenager, this was supposed to be the biggest day of his life, a chance to step into the world he had admired since childhood. He had worked harder than anyone, outshined hundreds of competitors, and secured a spot in an elite mentorship program at one of the country's top airlines. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, proof that he was on the right path. But the moment he entered the pilot's lounge, everything changed. The air went still. Conversations died. The stares weren't of curiosity. They were of judgment. It didn't matter how much he had studied or how much he had earned his place. To them, he didn't belong. What started as quiet glances soon turned into something much worse. A casual dismissal, a whispered accusation, a call to security. Before he knew it, he was being dragged out, his dream crumbling before his eyes, without having done a single thing wrong. But what no one in that room realized was that this wasn't just an ordinary student. And the mistake they had made? It was about to cost them everything. What would you do if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Because sometimes the ones you underestimate the most are the ones who hold all the power. Malcolm Carter stepped into the pilot's lounge, his visitor badge clipped neatly onto his jacket, his hands clasping the aviation guidebook he had been studying since morning. The room, filled with men and women in crisp pilot uniforms, carried an air of exclusivity that made his stomach tighten. He had dreamed of this moment, standing in the very place where pilots discussed routes, shared experiences, and prepared for flights. But the way heads turned as he entered sent a cold shiver down his spine. The murmurs were barely audible, yet Malcolm felt them like whispers against his skin. Unlike the other students participating in Horizon Airlines' prestigious mentorship program, he wasn't met with curiosity or casual nods. He was met with silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with respect. It was the kind of silence that weighed heavy, thick with the unspoken question. What is he doing here? A tall, gray-haired pilot near the coffee machine narrowed his eyes, watching Malcolm like he had walked into the wrong neighborhood. Malcolm swallowed hard, trying to remind himself that he belonged here. He had worked tirelessly to earn his spot in this program, outshining hundreds of applicants. He straightened his shoulders and made his way to an empty chair in the corner, placing his book down. Before he could sit, a voice cut through the air. "Hey kid, get me a black coffee, no sugar." Malcolm turned, blinking in surprise. The pilot who had spoken was Captain Douglas Reeves, a veteran with nearly 30 years of experience. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. He had simply assumed Malcolm was there to serve. For a moment, Malcolm hesitated, wondering if maybe this was some kind of test. When he didn't move, Reeves scoffed, shaking his head. "Hello? Coffee? Or do you need me to repeat it?" Malcolm's grip tightened around his guidebook. "Sir, I'm not." He took a breath, keeping his voice steady. "I'm a participant in the Horizon Mentorship Program. I'm supposed to be here." Reeves let out a sharp laugh, glancing around the room. A few pilots smirked, while others simply looked away, unwilling to interfere. "You're kidding, right?" He eyed Malcolm's badge like it was forged. "What? Did they start letting just anyone in now?" Heat crawled up Malcolm's neck. He had prepared for difficult tests, rigorous coursework, even intimidating interviews. But he hadn't prepared for this. He wasn't sure what was worse, the assumption that he didn't belong, or the laughter that followed it. "Let's see," Reeves continued, stepping closer. "You know the difference between a Boeing 737 and an Airbus A320? Malcolm nodded, his aviation knowledge kicking in automatically. The 737 has yoke controls, while the A320 uses a side stick. The engine nacelles on the 737 also have a distinct shape due to ground clearance issues." Reeves raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need a lecture. You memorized a couple of facts. Doesn't mean you have what it takes." Before Malcolm could respond, another pilot walked by, brushing past him as though he wasn't even there. His shoulder clipped Malcolm's, sending his guidebook tumbling to the floor. No one reacted. No one offered to help. Malcolm bent down, picking it up as Reeves chuckled. "Careful, kid. This isn't school. You step into a room like this, you better know your place." Malcolm sat stiffly in his chair, gripping his aviation guidebook and trying to drown out the lingering stares still cast in his direction after his earlier encounter with Captain Reeves. He focused on the text, forcing himself to concentrate on the technical details of aerodynamics, but the weight of the room pressed against him like an invisible force. The murmur of conversations had resumed, but the energy had shifted. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was an outsider being tolerated. Then a sudden, sharp voice cut through the air. "Where the hell is my wallet?" The room fell silent. Captain Linda Harrison stood near the coffee counter, her expression thunderous as she rummaged through her open bag. Items were scattered across the surface: lipstick, a boarding pass, a phone. But her wallet was missing. She whirled around, her eyes scanning the room, her frustration morphing into suspicion as she locked onto Malcolm. "You." Malcolm's stomach twisted. He looked up, blinking in disbelief. "Me." Linda marched toward him, her boots clicking against the floor with deliberate force. "You've been sitting here the whole time. Did you see anyone near my bag?" Malcolm straightened, willing his voice to stay calm. "No, ma'am." Her sharp gaze didn't waver. "Really?" She folded her arms, sizing him up. "You didn't happen to take a little walk? Maybe wander near the counter?" Malcolm's pulse quickened. "No, ma'am," he said again, his grip tightening on his guidebook. His words felt hollow in the silence that had settled over the room. Every pilot and crew member was now watching. He could feel their eyes drilling into him, feel the unspoken verdict forming. Linda scoffed, shaking her head. "Then maybe we should check, just to be sure." A heavy knot formed in Malcolm's throat. "Check what?" "Your bag." A slow dread crawled up his spine. He had heard stories before. His parents had warned him, told him what to do in moments like this. Stay calm. Don't argue. Cooperate. Even when it's unfair. Especially when it's unfair. Linda lifted her chin. Security. A uniformed officer entered the lounge within seconds. He glanced between Linda and Malcolm, his expression unreadable. "What's the issue?" "My wallet's missing," Linda said flatly. "And he's been sitting here watching everything." Malcolm opened his mouth to protest, then stopped himself. It wouldn't matter. It never did. The officer turned to him. "Son, would you mind opening your bag? Just to clear this up." Malcolm hesitated. His gut screamed at him to refuse, to demand some dignity, but he already knew how that would play out. Instead, he swallowed hard and unzipped his bag. The officer rifled through it, pulling out books, notebooks, a pair of headphones, nothing that remotely resembled a wallet. He straightened, glancing at Linda. "It's not here." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Linda's face, but it wasn't relief. It was doubt, disbelief. She leaned in slightly, scanning Malcolm as though she expected the wallet to materialize from thin air. "Doesn't mean anything," she muttered. "He could have stashed it somewhere." Malcolm clenched his jaw, keeping his hands steady on his lap. He had done everything right, everything he was supposed to, and still it wasn't enough. Linda let out a frustrated breath and waved a dismissive hand. "Fine. Forget it." The officer stepped back, his job apparently done. But the room hadn't moved on. The weight of judgment still hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. No one apologized. No one told Linda she was wrong. Malcolm felt the tension still pressing against his skin, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The accusation had passed, but the weight of it lingered. He closed his bag slowly, finger stiff, movements controlled. He knew better than to let his frustration show. He just needed to stay quiet, stay composed, and make it through the day. He picked up his guidebook and scanned the lounge for a seat, spotting an empty chair near the window. The spot was perfect, away from the worst of the stairs, close enough to observe the pilots preparing for their flights. He stepped forward, ready to sit, when a pilot beside the seat suddenly leaned over and dropped his flight bag onto the chair. Malcolm hesitated, glancing at the man, a tall, middle-aged pilot with silver streaks in his hair and a set jaw. The name tag on his uniform read Captain Eric Walker. Malcolm gestured at the seat, keeping his tone neutral. "Excuse me, sir. Is this taken?" Walker didn't even glance at him. "Yeah." Malcolm glanced around. There was no jacket, no coffee cup, no sign that anyone had claimed the chair before now. The bag had been placed there deliberately, a barrier designed just for him. Malcolm swallowed hard, nodding slightly as he backed away. Understood. He turned, scanning for another seat, but options were limited. The room wasn't full, yet every available chair seemed just out of reach. A few seats down, a young white cadet, another mentee from the program, watched the exchange with wide eyes. The kid shifted, almost as if he was about to offer the empty chair next to him. But before he could speak, Linda's gaze snapped toward him like a whip. Her expression was sharp, her posture rigid. It wasn't a direct threat, but it was enough. The cadet hesitated, glanced at Malcolm, then quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in his phone. Malcolm saw it all happen in a span of seconds. He understood the unspoken message. No one was going to offer him a place here, not even the ones who might have wanted to. Keeping his shoulders squared, he made his way to the farthest corner of the lounge, near a row of vending machines. It wasn't a proper seat, just a ledge barely wide enough to perch on, but it would have to do. His hands clenched around the book in his lap. He had studied too hard, worked too long for this opportunity. Yet here he was, sitting on the sidelines, as if he were nothing more than an observer. A group of pilots near the coffee machine broke into laughter. He didn't know if they were laughing at him, but at this point, it hardly mattered. Malcolm sat on the cold, hard ledge near the vending machines, gripping his guidebook and staring at the glossy cover without really seeing it. The laughter from across the room had died down, but the sting of it remained, buried under the weight of everything that had happened so far. He inhaled deeply, reminding himself why he was here. This was his dream. He just had to endure, just had to make it through. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to learn. Linda's voice cut through the air again, loud and mocking. "You kid, since you're so determined to be here, why don't you show us what you know?" Malcolm looked up warily, his heart sinking at the sight of her smirk. He hesitated, but knew ignoring her wasn't an option. "Excuse me." Linda folded her arms, tilting her head. "Let's see if you actually belong here, or if you're just playing dress up. Name the major components of a Boeing 747's hydraulic system." A test. A public spectacle disguised as a challenge. Malcolm felt every eye in the room shift toward him, waiting for him to stumble. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he had spent years studying aircraft schematics. He met her gaze, forcing his voice to stay steady. Primary hydraulic system includes 4 independent circuits, powered by engine-driven pumps. Backup systems rely on electric motor-driven pumps, accumulator reservoirs, and redundancy valves for safety. The system operates flaps, landing gear, spoilers, and thrust reversers. A brief silence followed. Someone near the back muttered, "Damn," barely audible over the hum of the lounge. Linda's smirk didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. Annoyance, maybe. She wasn't expecting a correct answer. Malcolm held his breath, knowing this wasn't over. Linda scoffed. "Not bad. But memorizing a textbook doesn't mean you have what it takes to fly. Being a pilot isn't just spitting out facts." She stepped closer, voice lowering slightly. "You actually have to be good under pressure. And from what I can see, you fold pretty damn fast." A few snickers followed. Malcolm clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay still. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that he had spent his entire life handling pressure, that he had fought twice as hard just to be allowed in this room. But he already knew what would happen if he pushed back. Linda turned away, as if dismissing him entirely. "Since you're so eager to contribute, I'm sure you won't mind helping keep this place presentable." She gestured toward the nearby table, where empty cups and snack wrappers had been left behind. "Clean that up. Show a little respect for where you are." Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. He looked around, scanning the room to see if anyone else had been asked the same thing. They hadn't. The cadets, the other pilots, they all remained where they were, untouched by this humiliation. He swallowed hard, forcing his legs to move, standing stiffly as he approached the table. Every step felt heavier than the last. He picked up the discarded coffee cups and napkins, his hands steady but his skin burning. He wasn't a janitor. He wasn't here to clean up after them. He had earned his spot in this program just like everyone else. But now he was nothing more than a spectacle, a silent lesson in hierarchy. Someone chuckled behind him. Guess he's finally found a job he's good at. The remark hit him harder than it should have, but Malcolm didn't react. He dumped the trash into the nearest bin, then turned back, expecting Linda to say something else, to pile on more humiliation. She simply nodded, as if satisfied. Good. At least you can follow basic instructions. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, she moved on, as if he was no longer worth her time. Malcolm sat back down, his hands gripping his guidebook so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. He could feel their stares, hear the whispers that weren't meant to be heard. Linda humiliated him, still gripping his aviation guidebook as if it could anchor him in a place that seemed determined to reject him. The laughter and whispers had faded, but the weight of them lingered. He told himself to breathe, to endure, to stay quiet just a little longer. Near the entrance of the lounge, a uniformed airport employee stood with his phone raised slightly, angling it toward Malcolm. The man wasn't pretending to text or scroll. He was filming. Malcolm caught the glint of the camera lens in his peripheral vision. He stiffened, but didn't react. The man leaned toward a coworker, muttering something, then smirked. A few seconds later, he tapped his screen and sent the video. Across the room, Linda leaned against a counter, scrolling through her phone. A pilot walked by, exchanging a few casual words with her. She chuckled, shaking her head slightly before glancing toward Malcolm. Her eyes narrowed. She straightened, murmuring something to the pilot, then turned and walked toward the security desk at the far side of the lounge. A creeping unease settled into Malcolm's chest. He shifted in his seat, scanning the room for Tanya Reynolds, the program coordinator who had invited him here. She was nowhere to be seen. Linda reappeared moments later, a uniformed security officer trailing behind her. The officer, a broad-shouldered man with a stern face, surveyed the room, then locked eyes on Malcolm. Linda's voice carried through the lounge, sharp and authoritative. "That's him." Malcolm tensed as the officer strode toward him, his hand already resting on his belt near the radio. The room quieted. Conversations died mid-sentence. The officer stopped in front of Malcolm, looking down at him. "Sir, I need to see some identification." Malcolm's fingers tightened around his book. His voice came out steady, though his heart pounded. "I have my visitor's pass. It's right here." He reached for the badge clipped to his jacket, but Linda spoke before he could unfasten it. "He doesn't belong here," she said coolly. "I don't even know how he got in." Malcolm's stomach dropped. He looked around, expecting anyone to correct her. No one did. The officer's expression hardened. "Step up." Malcolm hesitated. "I'm part of the Horizon mentorship program." "My guide," Linda cut him off. "His guide isn't here, is she?" She turned to the officer. "We have procedures for this, don't we? Unauthorized personnel in restricted areas." The officer nodded curtly. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Malcolm's pulse roared in his ears. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Then this will be quick," the officer replied, voice neutral but firm. "Let's go." A hand gripped Malcolm's upper arm, not roughly, but with enough pressure to make it clear he didn't have a choice. The room was deathly silent now. Dozens of eyes watched as he was pulled to his feet. Someone muttered, "Damn." Someone else whispered, "I knew it." The humiliation burned through Malcolm's chest like acid. He wasn't being escorted. He was being removed. Malcolm's pulse thundered in his ears as the officer led him out of the lounge, his grip still firm on Malcolm's arm. He fought the urge to yank away, knowing it would only make things worse. His breathing was controlled, but his chest burned with humiliation. Every step felt heavier as he was guided down a narrow hallway leading to a small security office. The sterile white walls and fluorescent lights made everything feel colder. The officer gestured for him to sit. Malcolm obeyed, forcing himself to remain composed. Across the desk, another officer, this one older with graying hair, picked up a pen and clipboard. "Full name," he said without looking up. Malcolm hesitated for half a second before answering. Malcolm Carter. The officer jotted it down, then leaned back, studying him. You know why you're here? Malcolm kept his voice steady. Because someone decided I shouldn't be. The officer didn't react. We received a report that you entered a restricted area without proper clearance. Malcolm gestured to his badge. I have clearance. The first officer, the one who had brought him in, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. We'll determine that. He nodded toward the clipboard. A report like this isn't just paperwork, son. This could end up on your record. Could make it harder for you to apply for flight school, get airline sponsorships, even work in aviation at all. Malcolm felt his stomach drop. He had known this was bad, but not this bad. His dream of becoming a pilot had always felt like something distant yet possible. Something within reach, if he just worked hard enough. Now it felt like it was being ripped away, not because he failed, but because someone had decided he didn't belong. He exhaled slowly. You can call Tanya Reynolds. She's my mentor. She invited me here. The older officer raised an eyebrow, flipping through a folder. We tried contacting her. No answer. Malcolm's heart pounded harder. That didn't make sense. Tanya wouldn't ignore something like this. Try again. Before either officer could move, a new voice cut in. That won't be necessary. Malcolm turned sharply. Linda Harrison stepped into the office, arms crossed, expression cool. The officer at the desk looked up. Captain Harrison, you made the report? Linda nodded. I did. She didn't look at Malcolm. And I can confirm there was a misunderstanding, but I also have concerns. The officer tapped his pen against the clipboard. Concerns. Linda tilted her head slightly, her tone careful. We can't ignore the possibility that his mentor would cover for him. We see it all the time, people bending the rules for students they favor. Malcolm stiffened. She wasn't just accusing him anymore. She was preemptively discrediting the only person who could clear his name. The older officer sighed, rubbing his temple. So you're saying even if his mentor confirms he was allowed in the lounge, we can't trust it? Linda shrugged. I'm saying we should consider all possibilities. Malcolm clenched his fists onto the desk, his nails digging into his palms. He knew what she was doing. She was cutting off his last escape route, making sure that even if Tanya called back, her word wouldn't matter. The first officer pushed off the wall, stepping forward. Without external verification, we have to proceed cautiously. If we can't confirm his access, we log the report. Malcolm's throat felt tight. This was it. If this went into their system, if his name ended up flagged, every flight school, every internship, every scholarship he applied for would see it. Not a conviction, not an arrest, just a report. A quiet stain that would follow him, casting doubt without needing proof. He inhaled deeply. I want to make a call. The older officer gestured toward the phone on the desk. You get one. Malcolm reached for it immediately, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed Tanya's number. The phone rang. Once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. He swallowed hard, trying again. Same result. He gritted his teeth. Something wasn't right. Tanya wouldn't ignore him. Malcolm set the phone down, his hands still trembling. The silence in the security office was suffocating. He could feel Linda's eyes on him, feel the weight of the officer's passive indifference. No Tanya. No way to prove his innocence. No way out. His entire future was now balanced on the words of people who had already decided he was guilty. The older officer exhaled and tapped his pen against the clipboard, the sound sharp and deliberate. Without confirmation, we proceed as reported. Linda folded her arms and shook her head, feigning disappointment. It's always the same. These kids think they can walk into spaces they don't belong in and rewrite the rules. She turned, raising her voice just enough to be heard beyond the office. But not here. Not today. The word stung, carrying an air of finality that made Malcolm's stomach twist. One of the officers leaned down slightly, his tone a forced attempt at reassurance. If this is just a misunderstanding, it'll be reviewed. But I'd recommend you cooperate. A refusal to comply will only make things worse for you. Malcolm barely heard him. The noise in his head, his own pulse hammering, The distant murmur of the lounge, the echo of Linda's voice, drowned everything else out. Linda sighed, checking her watch. "We have procedures for this, don't we?" She glanced at the officer by the door. "Escort him out." The command was casual, delivered with a level of detachment that made Malcolm's blood run cold. The officer by the door stepped forward, his grip firm as he reached for Malcolm's arm again. "Let's go." Malcolm jerked away instinctively, his breath shallow, panic rising. "Wait, I just need one more call." Linda laughed under her breath. "To who?" "Another mentor who conveniently isn't answering." Malcolm ignored her, gripping his phone. He had one person left. He dialed quickly, pressing the phone to his ear, praying she would pick up. The line rang once, twice. Then his mother's voice. "Malcolm." His throat closed up. He hadn't realized how close he was to breaking until he heard her. He forced his voice to stay steady, but it came out hoarse. "Mom, I need you at the airport. Now." There was a pause. Then her tone shifted, sharp with concern. "What happened?" Linda sighed dramatically, crossing her arms. "Oh, how adorable. Calling for mommy." The officers said nothing. They didn't need to. They had already made up their minds. Malcolm gripped the phone tighter. "Just come, please." He ended the call before she could ask anything else. He had no more words left. Linda smirked. And what's she supposed to do? Argue with airport security? Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't need to, because for the first time that day, he wasn't the one who needed to explain himself. The silence in the room pressed against him, suffocating, heavy with an unspoken finality. Linda remained by the desk, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, as if she had already decided this was over. The officers were no better. Their attention had already shifted, no longer focused on him, but on the paperwork, as if he had become nothing more than a name on a report, another file to be processed and forgotten. He wanted to speak, to push back, but the weight of the situation settled on him like concrete. Every word spoken against him had been designed to strip him of credibility. Every action meant to ensure he had no path to proving his innocence. His last hope, the single call he had made, sat unanswered in the air like a desperate plea to no one. Then, without warning, the silence was broken by the crackle of a radio. One of the officers stiffened as a voice came through, tense and urgent. "All available units, clear a path to the pilot's lounge immediately. VIP arrival. Repeat, VIP arrival." The officer at the desk frowned and exchanged glances with his colleague. Linda, standing off to the side, stiffened. The relaxed arrogance on her face flickered for the first time, replaced by something colder, something cautious. She straightened her posture, adjusting the sleeves of her uniform in an almost involuntary act of composure. "Who is it?" the officer asked into the radio. The response came back immediately. "CEO of Horizon Airlines. ETA 2 minutes." The room shifted. The atmosphere, once oppressive in a way that kept Malcolm pinned down, suddenly felt electric with uncertainty. Linda's lips parted slightly, a flicker of disbelief in her expression before she masked it with indifference. The officers straightened, adjusting their stance, their professional detachment now laced with a different kind of tension. Malcolm remained still, barely daring to breathe as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. They were sharp, measured, a confident rhythm against the tile that spoke of authority before a single word was even spoken. Then, the door swung open, and the world tilted. A woman stepped inside, dressed in a navy blue tailored suit, her presence effortlessly commanding. She carried herself with an air of quiet dominance, not the kind that needed to be asserted, but the kind that was simply understood. The crisp fabric of her jacket bore the unmistakable emblem of Horizon Airlines, and the polished CEO pin glinted under the fluorescent lights. But it wasn't the badge or the title that made the room shift around her. It was the way the officers instinctively took a step back, the way Linda's face paled slightly as realization dawned on her. Alicia Carter's gaze moved over the room with practiced ease, assessing, calculating. But the moment she locked eyes on Malcolm, everything else in her demeanor faded into something colder, something sharper. Her voice, when it came, was controlled, but it cut through the air like a blade. "Take your hands off my son." The silence that followed was absolute. Linda froze. Her entire body went rigid, her eyes widening in a way that betrayed her complete loss of control over the situation. The officers, whose hands had so easily pulled Malcolm from the lounge not long ago, suddenly looked uncertain. The weight of their authority, so firmly planted a moment ago, now felt precarious under the presence of the woman standing before them. Malcolm barely moved, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. His mother's expression didn't change. She didn't glance at Linda, didn't acknowledge the officers beyond what was necessary. She only saw him, and that was enough to make the entire room shift. Linda's voice came, but it wasn't as sharp as before. "Miss Carter." Alicia turned her head slightly, just enough to silence whatever excuse had been forming. She stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate. "Would someone like to explain," she said smoothly, "why my son is sitting in a security office instead of completing his mentorship program?" Neither officer spoke. Linda swallowed, her earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. There was a situation. Alicia arched an eyebrow, waiting. Linda hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "We received reports that he was in a restricted area without authorization. Given the circumstances, we had to act accordingly." Alicia's lips pressed into a thin line, but her voice remained measured. "And did anyone bother to verify his authorization before detaining him?" Alicia's gaze flickered over to the officers. "Did either of you confirm his credentials?" One of them cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "We, attempted to contact his mentor, but we couldn't reach her." Alicia nodded, as if considering the information. Then, in a voice that held nothing but quiet fury, she asked, "And that was enough to justify treating a Horizon Airlines mentorship student like a criminal?" The air in the room had shifted completely. The power that Linda had wielded so easily, the authority she had wrapped herself in like armor all day, was now slipping away in real time. Linda opened her mouth, but Alicia cut her off before she could speak. "No, actually, don't bother," she said coldly. "I already know the answer." Malcolm, for the first time all day, allowed himself to breathe. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken consequences. Alicia turned back to Malcolm, her expression softening only slightly. "Are you all right?" Malcolm nodded once, though the tightness in his chest remained. His mother's presence had lifted the immediate threat, but he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Alicia exhaled sharply and looked back at Linda, her voice colder than before. "We'll be discussing this further." Alicia let the silence stretch, her presence an undeniable force in the room. Linda, who had spent the entire day commanding attention, now stood frozen, her face pale. The officers, once so sure of their authority, avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably. Malcolm remained still, watching as his mother turned her full attention to the woman who had humiliated him. "Captain Harrison," Alicia said, her voice even controlled, but laced with unmistakable finality. "You are suspended immediately. Hand over your ID badge." Linda blinked, the words hitting her like turbulence she hadn't anticipated. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Miss Carter." Alicia raised a hand, cutting her off effortlessly. "Don't waste my time with excuses," she said sharply. "You had multiple opportunities to handle this situation professionally. Instead, you escalated it at every turn. Now, you'll face the consequences." A tense hush fell over the room. One of the officers cleared his throat, stepping slightly to the side as if distancing himself from Linda. She turned, eyes darting between them, searching for support, but no one met her gaze. The confidence that had carried her all day, the certainty that she could act however she pleased without repercussions, was crumbling beneath her feet. "I was following protocol," she attempted, voice weaker than before. Alicia scoffed. "Protocol?" She took a step closer, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "Show me the protocol that says an authorized mentorship student should be detained without verification. Show me the policy that justifies treating my son like a criminal. Show me, Captain Harrison, where in our training we encourage racial profiling. Linda swallowed hard. She had no answer. Alicia exhaled slowly, shaking her head. That's what I thought. She turned to the officers. Escort her to HR, effective immediately. She is no longer in charge of any flight operations. The order hung in the air, solid and immovable. One of the officers hesitated, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. Linda's face twisted with something unreadable. Anger, disbelief, maybe even fear. But she didn't argue. She couldn't. Instead, she pulled her badge from her uniform with shaking fingers, her knuckles white as she placed it on the desk. Alicia didn't spare her another glance. She turned back to Malcolm, her expression softening just slightly. Are you all right? Malcolm nodded, but the weight in his chest hadn't lifted yet. He had won, but the damage had been done. Alicia must have sensed it because she straightened, her voice carrying across the room. This isn't just about my son. Horizon Airlines will be conducting a full review of all reported incidents of discrimination within our ranks. If there are others like Captain Harrison, they will not remain employed here. This company will not tolerate prejudice at any level. A murmur spread through the lounge. Some pilots looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. A few even nodded, their expressions unreadable. Linda, standing by the door now with security flanking her, let out a bitter laugh. You think you can fix it all with a speech? Alicia met her gaze one last time. No, she admitted. But I can start by making sure people like you have no place in my airline. Linda had nothing left to say. She turned, shoulders hunched, and walked out. Linda walked through the hallway with security flanking her, her face blank, but her hands trembling slightly at her sides. The pilots and staff she had once commanded with ease now stood in silence, watching her exit. A few turned away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Others exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. One of them, a younger pilot she had mentored, muttered just loud enough for her to hear. Guess you finally got what you deserved. Linda's steps faltered for a split second before she straightened, lifting her chin as if pretending she was leaving on her own terms. But everyone knew the truth. Back in the lounge, Alicia turned toward Malcolm, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. It's over, she said softly. Malcolm wanted to believe that, but the weight in his chest remained. He had spent the entire day being torn down, humiliated, treated like an outsider in a space he had dreamed of belonging to. One victory couldn't erase that. Alicia seemed to sense his thoughts because her grip on his shoulder firmed. You don't just belong here, Malcolm. You earned your place here. And no one will ever take that from you again. A month later, Malcolm stood on a stage at Horizon Airlines' annual mentorship event. The room was filled with young, aspiring pilots, faces bright with excitement, the same excitement he had once carried before that awful day in the lounge. Standing beside him was Captain Amara Johnson, one of Horizon's most senior pilots, and now the head of the airline's diversity and mentorship initiative. Malcolm took a deep breath and stepped forward. A month ago, I sat in a pilot's lounge, thinking my dream was over, he began, his voice steady. I thought that because I had done everything right, studied, worked hard, earned my spot, nothing bad could happen. But I was wrong. Because for some people, no amount of hard work is enough. They'll look at you and decide you don't belong before you even get the chance to prove yourself. A quiet murmur passed through the audience. Some nodded. Some looked away, as if ashamed of what they knew was true. Malcolm continued. But that day also taught me something else. That no matter how many people try to push you out, there will always be others who pull you back in, who remind you that you do belong. His gaze swept across the room. You don't have to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. You just have to prove it to yourself. And when you do, no one can take it away. Beside him, Captain Johnson nodded, her expression proud. The future of aviation isn't just in new technology or faster planes, she said, stepping forward. It's in making sure the next generation of pilots, all pilots, are given the opportunities they deserve. The audience erupted in applause. Malcolm smiled, feeling something settle inside him. The weight of that day in the lounge would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined him. It was just one part of his journey, a part that had made him stronger. And as he looked out at the hopeful faces in the crowd, he knew one thing for certain. His dream had never been over. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to help spread awareness. What do you think was the most intense moment? Did you expect the final twist? Let us know in the comments. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.